On the night of April 26, 1986, in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, there was a young city called Pripyat. It was not an ordinary place. With its wide streets, new apartment blocks, schools, parks, and cultural centers, Pripyat was one of the showcase cities of Soviet modernity. Most of the people living there were young. Many were engineers, technicians, teachers, or families just beginning their lives. The average age was low. The city felt like it belonged to the future, and at the center of that future, just a few kilometers away, stood a structure that defined everything around it. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant. People did not look at that plant with fear. They looked at it with pride, because at the time, nuclear energy was not seen as just a power source. It was a symbol of progress, a physical expression of science, discipline, and state power. The atom was presented less as a threat and more as a promise. Electricity, efficiency, development, control. The story the system told was simple. Nature could now be managed. If humanity became organized enough, even the most dangerous forces on Earth could be put to work. And that is exactly why the Chernobyl disaster was never just a reactor accident. Because what exploded that night was not only uranium, graphite, and steam. What exploded was the story of a system that believed it was in control. When most people think about Chernobyl, they think about the explosion first. A glowing core, burning graphite, helicopters, abandoned cities, protective suits, silent classrooms, a rusting Ferris wheel. But disasters usually do not begin in a single moment. They arrive through a buildup of earlier decisions, ignored warnings, and small weaknesses inside a larger system. What the workers were trying to do that night in Reactor 4 sounds, at first, technical and almost boring. A safety test. The plant staff wanted to find out how long the turbines could continue providing electricity after a power loss. The idea was this: if external power was cut, could the spinning turbines keep supplying enough energy for a short time until the emergency generators fully came online? On paper, it sounded reasonable. The problem was that this test had already been attempted before and had not worked properly. So the team was not just exploring something new, they were also trying to solve an unresolved weakness, and the test was going to be carried out under conditions in which the reactor could behave more unpredictably. At some point, this stopped being a matter of, let's run a test. It became, let's complete this test no matter what. And that is where the technical process started to merge with institutional culture. Because like many major disasters, Chernobyl was not just about the machine. It was not just about the people either. It was about the way people were trained to approach machines inside a system that discouraged doubt. The reactor type used at Chernobyl was the RBMK. It had certain advantages. It was large, it was powerful. In some ways, it fit Soviet energy strategy well, but it also carried serious design flaws. One of the most dangerous was that the reactor could become unstable at low power levels. A simple way to think about it is this: every complex system has a range in which it behaves safely. Move outside that range, and the system may begin reacting in ways that are difficult to predict. That night, one of the things happening at Chernobyl was that the reactor was being pushed toward exactly those dangerous conditions. At the same time, several automatic safety systems had been disabled during the preparation for the test. This was done because the test itself required procedures to be bent. That point matters a lot. When people look back at disasters, they often search for one mistake, as if someone simply pressed the wrong button, and that alone caused everything. But real disasters usually do not work like that. What happens instead is that people remove layers of safety one by one, each one seeming temporary, each one seeming manageable, each one seeming justified, until all of them exist together. That is exactly what happened that night. The test was delayed, the power level dropped, then it dropped far lower than intended. That made the reactor even more unstable. The operators tried to raise power again. To do that, they took actions that pushed beyond procedural limits. Most of the control rods were withdrawn. The reactor drifted further and further away from the conditions in which it was supposed to operate safely. From the outside, this still looked like a control room. Screens, buttons, meters, trained personnel. But inside that room, the distance between the feeling of control and the reality of the situation was getting wider by the minute. This is where psychology becomes important. If a system has given you confidence for years, it becomes harder to see it as dangerous, especially if you were trained inside it, especially if you were told repeatedly that it was safe, and especially if you were working inside a culture where questioning that confidence could threaten careers, reputations, or the image of the institution itself. The Soviet nuclear system was not just an engineering project, it was also a prestige project. It had to look successful. It could not appear weak. Openly admitting serious design flaws was not just a technical issue. It could easily become a political one. That is why some weaknesses, even when known, were never fully allowed to rise to the surface. This is actually a very familiar pattern. When an institution becomes deeply invested in its own success story, it stops treating failure as a technical possibility and starts treating it as a threat to order. And once that happens, people stop measuring reality honestly. They start protecting the system's image. That night at Chernobyl, the operators were dealing not only with physics, but with institutional habit. The reactor was becoming unstable, but people still wanted to believe they were operating within a manageable process, because the alternative explanation was far more frightening. Maybe the system was not as safe as it claimed to be. On April 26, 1986, at around 1 hour 23 minutes and 4 seconds in the morning, the test began. Within seconds, the reactor's condition worsened. Power surged suddenly. The operators pressed the emergency shutdown button. That button was supposed to bring the reactor safely to a stop, but this is where one of the most terrifying design flaws revealed itself. Because of the structure of the control rods, inserting them at that moment did not immediately reduce reactivity. For a brief moment, it increased it. In a reactor that was already unstable, that was enough to push everything over the edge. What followed happened very fast. The sudden power surge ruptured fuel channels. Massive steam pressure built up. The first explosion hit. Then a second, more destructive explosion followed. The upper part of the reactor building was torn apart. A huge concrete and steel cover was displaced. Graphite was thrown into the open air. Fires broke out, and in that moment, this was no longer a plant malfunction. It had become an open-core nuclear disaster. The horrifying part is that even in those first minutes, many people still did not fully understand what had happened, because they did not have a mental framework for something on this scale. Some people did not even want to accept the idea that the reactor itself had exploded, because in their world, that was almost unthinkable. When the explosion happened, everyone could see the smoke. They could see the wreckage, the broken concrete, the fire, the burning roof, but the real danger was invisible. That is part of what makes radiation so psychologically terrifying. It is not like fire, it is not like water. It does not make a sound as it approaches. It has no smell, no color. It does not announce itself, but it can enter your body. It can damage your cells, and you may not feel any of it in the moment. The first firefighters who arrived believed they were responding to a normal industrial fire. They climbed onto rooftops. They tried to extinguish burning debris. In the dark, they handled pieces of graphite that had been thrown from the reactor. Some mistook them for ordinary wreckage. In reality, those fragments were dangerous enough to deliver lethal doses of radiation within minutes. These men were heroes, but they were also being sent into a disaster that had not been honestly explained to them. No one fully told them what they were facing. Maybe because their superiors did not fully understand it either. Maybe because people wanted to prevent panic. Or maybe because the system itself was not ready to admit the scale of what had happened. The outcome did not change. Many of the first responders became severely ill from acute radiation exposure that night and in the days that followed. Some died soon after. The first victims of Chernobyl were not only exposed to the explosion, they were exposed to ignorance. A few kilometers away from the plant, in Pripyat, people woke up the next morning as if life were normal. Children went to windows. Families made breakfast. People prepared for work. It was spring. Some later described a strange metallic taste in the air and an unusual feeling hanging over the city. Some had seen an eerie glow in the night sky. But for a while, life kept moving as if nothing irreversible had happened. This is one of the most disturbing images in the entire Chernobyl story, because the disaster had already begun. But daily life did not know it yet. People were walking through an invisible cloud. Children were playing outside. Windows were open. No one truly grasped that an entire city was being exposed to radiation. Evacuation did not happen immediately. Looking back now, that delay seems almost impossible to understand. But behind it was the same logic once again. First, understand the situation, then wait for instructions from above, then avoid panic. The system's instinct was simple: preserve order first. But radiation does not wait for bureaucracy. The people of Pripyat were only evacuated about 36 hours after the explosion. Buses arrived. Residents were told they were leaving for only a few days. They were instructed to take only basic belongings. Many left behind pets, family photographs, clothing, toys, and the ordinary details of their lives. Most of them never returned. One of the most important parts of the Chernobyl disaster is that the story is not just about the explosion itself. It is also about what happened afterward, because what was being tested here was not only a reactor, it was also a governing model. In the first hours and days, the flow of information was extremely limited. At the local level, there was uncertainty. At the central level, admission came slowly. In moments like this, the Soviet Union did not instinctively choose openness. It chose control. That logic can even sound understandable at first. Prevent panic. Preserve order. Do not show weakness to the outside world. But the problem is that in some crises, trying to manage appearances makes the crisis worse. That is exactly what happened at Chernobyl. The world did not first learn the scale of the accident from Soviet disclosures. It became clear something was wrong when workers at a nuclear facility in Sweden detected elevated radiation. In other words, the disaster announced itself not first through the Soviet state, but through instruments in another country. Symbolically, that was a devastating moment. The Soviet state had effectively revealed its own disaster to the world through someone else's sensors, and it showed that the regime's control over information was no longer as complete as it wanted to believe. After the reactor exploded, one of the biggest problems was that the core was open and the fire was still burning. This was not just a physical fire. It was a process that was releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere. Firefighters tried to contain the initial blazes. Then helicopters were used. Sand, boron, lead, clay, and other materials were dropped from above. Even today, there is debate about how effective some of those measures really were, how much of the response was symbolic, and how many new risks it created. At the same time, there was an even greater fear. If the molten material from the reactor moved downward and interacted dangerously with lower systems, the catastrophe could become even worse. That meant thousands of people had to take enormous personal risks to contain, isolate, and clean up the site. These people would later become known as the liquidators. They were Chernobyl's invisible army: soldiers, engineers, miners, pilots, workers. Some cleared debris, some cleaned the area around the reactor. Some climbed onto roofs because robots failed under intense radiation. Some dug tunnels. Some entered lethal zones for only a few minutes at a time and then came back out. Chernobyl is not only a story about failure, it is also a story about people who paid for other people's failures with their own bodies. This is the most important distinction to make. Chernobyl was not simply operator error. That explanation is too comforting. If the disaster had only been the result of a few bad decisions by a few individuals, the story would be easier to contain. You could assign blame, punish a few people, and move on. But Chernobyl remains powerful because it showed how a system can convince itself that it is more stable than it really is. Yes, terrible decisions were made that night. Yes, procedures were violated. Yes, human error played a major role, but there were also design flaws. Those flaws had not been shared transparently enough. The safety culture was weak. The hierarchy made it difficult to object. Pressure to succeed distorted how risk was understood. Information was held back not to protect people, but to protect control. So what exploded inside that reactor was not only a physical chain reaction, it was a chain reaction inside an institution. That is why Chernobyl remains such a universal story. Because it is not only about the Soviet Union, it is about a broader human pattern. Our tendency to trust complex systems too much, to underestimate structural weakness, and to protect order long after honesty becomes more necessary. The effects of the disaster did not remain inside one city. Winds carried radioactive material across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and into other parts of Europe. Some regions were hit harder than others. Belarus in particular suffered heavily from fallout. But Chernobyl's impact was not just geographic, it was psychological, because people were forced to realize something unsettling. The risks created by modern systems do not stop at national borders. A technical failure inside one country could reach the soil, milk, rain, and children of another country. That was one of the harshest lessons of the nuclear age. As technology becomes more powerful, failure becomes more powerful too. And in some systems, failure does not stay local. In that sense, Chernobyl was not just a Soviet disaster. It was a dark warning from modernity itself. Before Chernobyl, nuclear energy was widely presented as a symbol of the future. There were critics, certainly. There were protests. There were fears. But for many governments, nuclear power still represented science, independence, and progress. After Chernobyl, that changed. Suddenly, the question was no longer only about efficiency. It was also this: no matter how powerful a system is, what happens when it fails? And the problem was not only technical safety. People also began asking another question. If something goes wrong, will we be told the truth? That was a major turning point. Because Chernobyl did not only damage trust in nuclear technology through the explosion itself, it damaged trust in institutions. And often, the legitimacy of a technology depends as much on trust as it does on engineering. People do not only ask, does this system work? They also ask, if it fails, will I be told honestly? Chernobyl did not single-handedly destroy the Soviet Union, but it exposed, with unusual force, just how fragile an already weakening system had become. The economic burden was enormous. Cleanup, evacuation, health consequences, relocation, and containment all came at a massive cost. But perhaps even more damaging was the ideological cost. The Soviet system presented itself as disciplined, scientific, powerful, and historically justified. Chernobyl opened a deep crack in that image, because what people saw was not just an accident. They also saw denial, delay, secrecy, vulnerability. Mikhail Gorbachev would later suggest that Chernobyl was one of the key turning points in the unraveling of the Soviet system. That was not an exaggeration. Some events do not only take lives, they also destroy the story a regime tells about itself. Chernobyl was one of those events. When you look at Pripyat today, the most striking thing is not simply the scale of the destruction, it is the sense of interrupted life. Books left behind in classrooms, gymnasiums, apartment hallways, hospital beds, the amusement park, faded writing on walls, children's rooms. All of it creates the same feeling. People left in a hurry, and life never came back. That is part of why Chernobyl remains so powerful in memory. It is not just an image of explosion, it is an image of an abandoned future. The modern world usually gives us the sense that systems will continue, electricity will come, water will run, institutions will function. morning will arrive and life will go on. Chernobyl showed the opposite. Sometimes systems do not continue. Sometimes a single night begins a silence that lasts for decades. So what is the real answer to the question, what really happened at Chernobyl? The real answer is this. It was never just a reactor explosion. Yes, a safety test spiraled out of control. Yes, people made terrible mistakes. Yes, design flaws turned those mistakes into catastrophe. But beneath all of that, something deeper was happening. A system failed to see its own weaknesses honestly. Risk was treated as manageable long after it was not. Safety became a matter of procedure rather than culture. Information stopped being a tool for protection and became a tool for control. And when disaster came, the first instinct was not to tell the truth, but to preserve the image of order. That is the real story of Chernobyl. It begins where technology and institutional arrogance meet, and that is why Chernobyl does not belong only to the past. It remains a warning, because today the world still runs on systems that are increasingly complex. Energy grids, financial networks, digital platforms, AI systems, logistics chains, health infrastructure, data centers, automation, and every era has its own version of the Chernobyl question. How safe is this system, really? Who knows where its weaknesses are? Who is allowed to speak? And if something goes wrong, how long will it take before the truth is told? If Chernobyl still feels so alive in people's minds today, it is not only because of the scale of the tragedy, it is because the disaster exposed something deeply familiar about human systems. People quickly learn to trust what they believe they can control. Institutions can fall in love with their own success stories. And when a system becomes large, prestigious, and essential, it becomes even harder to admit that it might also be fragile. But physics does not listen to propaganda. Radiation does not care about hierarchy. Reality emerges sooner or later. That is what really happened at Chernobyl. That night, it was not only a nuclear power plant that exploded. One of the most dangerous illusions of the modern world exploded with it. The illusion that a system which looks powerful must also be safe. And maybe that is why, when we look at Chernobyl, we are not only looking at the past, we are also looking at ourselves.